Hi, everybody. As the title to this one suggests, we're kind of briefly talking about the Triffin dilemma. I kind of am making this in follow-up to the video I put up, I think, yesterday. Just going to make this a quick one because I didn't really bring up the Triffin dilemma, and I saw a lot of comments on that video regarding, the place of the U.S. and the quote-unquote world order and how all that's working out. I'll get to that in a minute. One sort of show note worth noting is, the original video I did, it's sort of out in the open here, it was about, if you're good at something, never do it for free. And I got an email from somebody who said, well, you're putting out these videos, you're doing that for free. Well, I never claimed I was good at analysis of geopolitics or economics or anything like that. I'm very much a rank amateur. My background is most definitely in the legal world. I have a law degree. I am an attorney by training and by profession. I have an undergrad degree in political science. Again, I've been an amateur follower of economics and geopolitics for years, and I've lived in Thailand for 15 years. So I've had to live in kind of an international context. But I don't think I'm good to the point of being worthy of being paid to just talk and riff about what's going on out there in the world. So that's the reason for the videos. And also, it's the nature of the beast on YouTube. You need content to sort of keep the thing rolling along, which is kind of the point. So reason for this video is I forgot to mention in my prior video that I just did where I was talking about, things are changing rapidly, especially for the US dollar. Things here on the Eurasian landmass are radically shifting in terms of, we're now seeing China and Russia are cooperating and engaging in bilateral trade in their own currencies now. China and Brazil are talking about the same thing. This will have tremendous long-term ramifications for the dollar. Of this, there is no doubt. And you can watch a million YouTube videos that have already been made on that. Now, as I said in the other video, I think the one little piece of insight that maybe I could provide is that on the one side, you've had a lot of people that have just been completely oblivious to this, and this is hitting them like a ton of bricks. Meanwhile, you've got people that were very well aware of this that I believe are a little bit too hyperbolic in how they think this is going to play out moving forward. I think they think that any day now the other shoe is going to drop and sort of the US dollar will just sort of disappear from world trade. Again, I'm being a little bit over-exaggerating there, but I'm not too far off. I think there are people, very intelligent people, who are very concerned that the U.S. dollar is just going to fall off a cliff. I'm not saying that's impossible to happen. I want to be clear on that. But I've just been around long enough to see that when major things happen, they tend to happen in a more nuanced way to what people think, how they think they will happen. So that's kind of a recap of the last video. Point of this video is it was a point I didn't bring up and I meant to bring up in the last video, which is the issue of Triffin's dilemma. So for those who are unaware of what Triffin's dilemma is basically the notion that a reserve currency will end up hollowing out its own domestic production base because they have to, or that polity, whatever you want to call it, that entity, that currency creator, if you will have to run a trade deficit, which effectively means they have to print a bunch of money and send it overseas to keep the overseas market for that currency liquid, which is what we've seen now for years. And when we look back at the TARP situation, the famous or maybe infamous interview with Bernanke where he was talking about that tons of TARP money just immediately went into European banks. Well, that was what that was for. It was to fulfill that Triffin's dilemma issue of keeping the foreign market for the currency liquid, in this case, the Eurodollar market. That's my understanding. And again, I'm an amateur, and I'm always happy to stand corrected in the comments wherever, or to find new insights if I don't understand what's going on. But it's my understanding that effectively the Fed back in 2000, I believe 9, when they were sort of opened their nose and began pouring out money, a lot of it went to Europe, and a lot of it went to Europe to capitalize the Eurodollar market. That was my understanding of how that went. That is from what I understand to be classic Triffin dilemma stuff. But I would have to imagine that the Triffin dilemma would operate in the reverse, what I'm saying here is let's say over the course of the rest of the decade, for example, and that may be being conservative, but over the course of the next decade, the dollar lost 40% of its value today, the way it trades today. If that were to happen, I think one could presume, and especially, again, and I didn't go, I think, far enough in the last video on the notion that, hey, the dollar is the dominant right now global reserve currency, but it's bandied about as if it's the only global reserve currency. That's not true. And the dollar's dominance, if you will, in terms of when you look at central banks and their currency positions, the dollar's position vis-a-vis other currencies has been slowly going down over time. And I believe this especially can be seen vis-a-vis the euro, although I think that's moving in the other direction. And in fact, and I'm not a euro expert, so I'm not going to go too far down this road, but I think the euro is probably in more trouble than the dollar, all things considered. Leaving that aside, because I don't think I have the depth of knowledge to even, on an amateur level, go into analysis of the euro. Yeah, okay, let's presume the ruble's going to rise up now and start becoming more actively used in the international markets, trade markets, commodities, whatever. And let's say the yuan is going to move the same way. And again, I believe in the prior video I referenced a video to Mr. Chappell's video on China Uncensored, where he said presently the yuan makes up like 2% of global denominated trade, 2% of global trade is denominated in yuan. And I'm citing him, and I'm kind of presuming that that's about right. That wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, the yuan really effectively, again, as we noted in the other video, it's not a currency in the same sense that the dollar is, because it's under strict control domestically, the renminbi and the yuan. There are heavy currency controls associated with that currency, and it doesn't seem like the Chinese really want to change that. So it's interesting that the ruble and the yuan are entering this sort of combine to kind of mutually benefit each other in a currency way. Point I'm trying to make is, if the dollar begins to decline in usage in terms of total global trade, if it starts to go down, I think one could surmise that then as a result, where the United States cannot just export paper, green paper, and in reality, as George Gammon says, ones and zeros, which is all that's really happening. When they can't do that for every single transaction, then over time, they're going to have to start producing more and more goods and services for trade. And this could turn out to be a very good thing. We could even see a situation where there's onshoring of jobs that were previously offshored, although with robotics and things, I question whether or not the same jobs are going to return. Also, honestly, I think it might be wishful thinking to think you can just sort of, put up heavy manufacturing like a carnival ride again, especially where you sort of lose the institutional knowledge that went along with having it in the first place. But that said, I think it's definitely possible. I think a small silver lining, and I state this unequivocally, small silver lining to this whole thing is that long term, as a result of the sort of reversal of the Triffin dilemma, we may end up with we in the United States, Americans may end up with a more dynamic domestic economy than presently exists. Again, maybe wishful thinking. Also, I'm not saying this without realizing there's going to be a major period of time where there's going to be a lot of economic hurt, pain. There's going to, and Jay Powell has used the word pain repeatedly in many of the statements, that have come out from at various times, Jackson Hole and all of this, talking about pain. He's been clear. The head of the Federal Reserve has been clear that pain is in the offing. And I don't know that folks domestically back in the States are fully aware of what that means. In fact, I think that they're woefully ignorant on a certain level, or a certain portion of the population is. Now, it's my understanding people are kind of getting more hip to this, but I wanted to be clear about something I left out in the prior video. Yeah, Triffin's dilemma, it's a bad deal, but if it can be reversed over time, then ultimately that could lead to an okay outcome for the United States, but it's going to be after a great deal of pain. Of that, there is no doubt. Now, again, I'm not a super duper doom and gloomer, but when I say pain, it means quite honestly, when I left the United States, one of the reasons I left was because I'd come out of law school, and I'm originally from Kansas. There were virtually no opportunities that I could really see other than going to work as a government attorney, being like a prosecuting attorney and sort of being on track to maybe one day being a judge or something like this. And then the other thing was, and this was totally disparate from the legal profession, I had worked my way through law school working in the casino business, and that was the major route I was looking at if I had stayed in the United States, was to stay with I won't say which brand, but it was a major brand. It's one of the big two in Vegas now. I was looking at staying with them, and they were very clear. They were very happy to put me in a junior executive program. I had come up from being, a blackjack dealer, dealt all the games minus roulette, and I hadn't gone to management or anything yet. I was considered part-time, although I did enough hours that I got some full-time benefits, which was really nice of them. But I ultimately decided to do what I thought was going to be a year in Korea. It turned out to be 15 years in Asia, and it ended up being 15 years in Southeast Asia, 15 and a half years total in Asia, and 15 years in Southeast Asia. Point I'm trying to make is I looked around and said, wow, there are really no major opportunities, at least that I could see in the Midwest of the United States, specifically Kansas. There were no great opportunities for attorneys. And that really, in my opinion, says something about the real, I want to be clear, the real economy as opposed to the financialized economy. The United States' economy has become, I would argue, hyper-financialized at this point. And when I say financialized, what I mean to say is we're at the point where we're just moving around paper or ones and zeros. I remember years ago, I want to find this article if I can again. Somebody was talking about sort of the future of work and that automation, and I think we're starting to see this with ChatGPT and all this good stuff. Automation was going to change the game of work in America, and they brought up a class of workers. There would be this sort of idle elite, and then there would be kind of a bunch of people on what effectively we now call UBI, Universal Basic Income, basically the dole, for lack of a better term. And I'm not. There may be some applications for something akin to UBI that may work in sort of a limited capacity. But when I look at the issue of UBI, I always look at it and I'm like, well, if you just give people money for nothing, the economy is going to end up stagnating. There's just no way around it. And I think we saw that with the aftermath of the COVID lockdowns and everything, both in the United States and elsewhere. Although I have to say in Thailand, I'm really proud of the Thais. And this is mostly because there were not a bunch of government handouts, I think. But Thais, the minute we got reopened, Thais were right on it, getting things reopened, getting their businesses back on track. Because quite frankly, we went through just a period of, I hesitate to say hell, but it was pretty darn hellish in terms of the economic sense. And I watch people's businesses that have been around for years go belly up. But long story short, back to UBI and back to this article, they talked about, there'd sort of be this elite that kind of controlled everything, and then there'd be this mass of people receiving UBI that kind of they didn't really have jobs in the sense of jobs. They just sort of, frankly, it sounded to me like they were just constantly having to fill out paperwork for the government. That was kind of how it was described. But then there was this other sort of discrete subset of folks that were going to sort of come out of the upper middle and the middle class who essentially became what were called symbol movers. I remember I need to go find this article. I'll dig around for this. But it was called symbol movers. And I totally understand what they're saying, because that's essentially what the law is you take these phrases that have legal meaning, what they call terms of art, and you sort of move them around, and you try to sort of manipulate them to get to your end, if you will, with the law. And you can see the same phenomenon happening in accounting, albeit you're sort of using numbers and concepts differently. I think you could argue that this is occurring maybe even in the medical profession to one degree or another, although that's a much more hands-on field and it's less of a sort of esoteric profession. But sort of these symbol movers, these people that move symbols around and move them in the right way to affect sort of a certain outcome within a governmental structure, if you will. I mean, every time I thought about it, I kept thinking of the Soviet era, the notion of the nomenklatura, this elite that were kind of there. And then you have like sort of apparatchiks who sort of know how the bureaucracy works and the buttons and the levers and the pulleys and how all that goes. That's what I thought about when I read it at the time, thought about symbol movers. But the point I'm trying to make is, yeah, I could see where we're moving into something like that, or we're already there to a certain extent. In fact, I would argue maybe that this financialization, hyper-financialization, hyper-financialized economy that is the United States has all these symbol movers, but unlike what they were talking about with the future of sort of automation in that UBI context in that article I was saying before, these are sort of symbol movers who have been created as a result of this era of easy money, where money has just been pushed out into the economy, and it's resulted in a lot of warping of the economy, where you've got a lot of people operating in the economy who are, it's kind of that line from that film Office Space where the consultant asks the guy, "What would you say it is you do here?" Those kind of folks that work in this sort of white collar atmosphere, and you can't really figure out what they're doing. And I would argue that happened as a result of both the easy money years that the United States has gone through really since the last, what some call the financial crisis. I do have to defer to Mr. Alistair McLeod, who refers to it as the Lehman crisis as opposed to the financial crisis, because his thinking is we haven't gone through the financial crisis yet. We put it on hold and we deferred it, arguably making it worse, probably making it worse. But that crisis back in 2009, 6, 7, 8, really 7, 8, 9, or maybe 8, 9, was the Lehman crisis, not really the global financial crisis. Some people call it the GFC, whatever. Point being, we have just it's like putting money through a wood chipper. I mean, just sort of scattering it throughout the land. That's sort of what we did. And due to the Cantillon effect, the sort of financial mandarins, if you will, had first access to that money and did what they did with it, usually trying to get financialized money to make them more money. What Marx and oftentimes Mr. Chris Hedges, who's somebody I really read a lot, refers to as fictitious capital. Because effectively that's what it was. They were just making up money out of thin air and then putting it in the economy as if it was duly formed capital, if you will. And it resulted in a massive warping. I'll go ahead and put up a link in this video. There's a great video by the guys over at the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, where they have this video following around. It's one of these people that she was a young lady that worked at LinkedIn. And she did this sort of TikTok or whatever about her day at LinkedIn, following around for a day at LinkedIn. And these guys are sitting there looking at it, and they're saying, what's going on here? This person, the big question is, what quote-unquote work are you doing? And, I'm not here to denigrate that woman or anything like that. I don't know what her day-to-day is, although from what she herself put out, I question the value in that organization that she's putting in exchange for, and they go through all of it, the money she's being compensated with. I question if they're getting value for money on that. Now, maybe they are, because, effectively she's sort of an advertiser, and a ton of people watch that video, and then a ton more as a result of those Lotus Eater guys picking it up. watched it too. So maybe there was value gain for LinkedIn. I don't know. What I'm saying is this hyperfinancialization led to a warping in the economy of the United States, which created a lot of unnecessary both jobs and just unnecessary orders of operation occurring in that economy. And it also created this hyper-financialized economy that's totally attenuated from the realities of the world. That every time I go back to the United States, I'm always fascinated by, there was one trip I went back. I was only there for 2 weeks. I want to say it was in 2013. My mind was boggled by the death of all retail. I was just riding around little old Wichita, Kansas, and every retail shop, it seemed like, was gone. It boarded up. The next time I went back, which I would say was sometime around 16 or 17, I was fascinated by the fact that it seemed like everywhere you went where all the retail shops had gone away, it seemed like there was a microbrewery that popped up. So, and I don't know the exact, that's just a couple of pieces of anecdotal evidence apropos of nothing. But when I saw that the retail shops were gone, okay, I attributed that sort of to Amazon. But also, when we now look at like American GDP and things, again, as to sort of stand on the shoulders of a giant and quote Alasdair MacLeod, he brings up the fact that, all of this is measured in bank credit. So it's all measured through a lens of financialization. And where the United States has become hyper-financialized, one has to wonder if perhaps that lens has not become distorted insofar as how it views the actual underlying economy. What does that mean? I'm not precisely sure. But what I do think will happen as a result of the diminishing use of dollars in a global economic sense, in the global economy, the diminishing use of dollars in the global economy will, in my opinion, will likely result in the diminishing of the hyper-financialized state of the present economy in the United States, and will also result in a sort of reversal of the Triffin dilemma, meaning that what I hope would happen over the course of the coming years would be that, Americans are going to have to go through this massive readjustment where they're going to have to get away from having the foundations of their livelihoods and their lives, their living standards, based on just a constant printing of money, of currency, bank credit into the economy effectively. They're going to have to get used to that, and that's going to result in a diminishing or an apparent diminishing. Like, I would argue that maybe some of the things that are quote-unquote lost are things that really you didn't want to begin with. I mean, to my mind, there's a lot of unnecessary bureaucracy just living now. And I'm going to do another video on this soon because there's another guy, a guy named Charles Hugh Smith talks about this a fair bit, where through websites and things, the service sector is really, really terrible in many ways now, especially in any time anybody in a service business tells me, well, go check our website, that's the point at which I want to start searching for a different vendor, because oftentimes, however their website works, they think it works fine, but they want you to learn how to use their website to interact with them. I've never really liked that. I'm kind of digressing. I'll do another video on that. But what I'm saying is, tremendous amounts of currency being pumped into the U.S. system resulted in a warping of the overall economy and a creation of unnecessary jobs and, in my opinion, unnecessary hoops and hurdles to get otherwise easy things done. Also, it resulted in the Triffin dilemma, where we had to run trade deficits and therefore hollow out our own internal economy. A perfect example of this is the offshoring of manufacturing that presumably, now this is going to take a while, would come back as the currency system and the financial system becomes more in line with the underlying real economy. I think that would occur. It's going to take a while, but I think it would occur. So again, it's sort of in follow-up to the prior video. I don't think this is going to be fun. In fact, I really do not like to be sitting here in Thailand sort of watching this sort of unfold. I'm not one of these people that liken it to the fall of the Roman Empire. I don't believe that. If anything, I think the better historical analogy would probably be the Eastern Empire right about the time of Diocletian right now. I think that's probably where we're at, sort of, if you're going on a timeline. If you're trying to analyze it analogically along the timeline, I think that's probably somewhere where we're at. Exactly where, I don't know, and I don't think that's even a perfect fit because, as they say, history doesn't repeat itself necessarily, but it rhymes. Well, this is one of those situations where I think it's rhyming with the sort of Eastern Empire during the era of Diocletian. Or, I can't remember. Yeah, he split it up, so, yeah, I guess it's the Eastern Empire. In any event, to sort of round this out, one silver lining of what's going on is that I think longer term, the U.S. is going to get back to what it's good at doing, which is making stuff and building stuff. And hopefully that'll happen sooner rather than later. So everybody who's watching, thanks for watching. Everybody who's subscribed, wow. I'm really humbled. I thought I'd get a couple hundred migrating over from the Integrity channel. I really appreciate you coming over here. Really appreciate your comments. Really appreciate your likes. Thanks so much for being here. And so to everybody out there, have a good one.